Good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to see you all here. A lot of friends and faces from the professional realm and beyond. So my name is Sharon Golan-Yaron. I'm the head of the research department of the Liebling Haus. So we are a joint collaboration of the municipality of Tel Aviv, the engineering department, the conservation department, and the German government in form of the interior ministry. The Liebling Haus is dealing with architecture, with conservation, with urbanism. And this is one of our lectures from the research lab, bringing you interesting topics dealing with contemporary conservation methodologies and urbanism at large. Soon you will be able to come to our center again. We have wonderful exhibitions lining up for you and very interesting seminars. So I'm very pleased to invite you to the center, hopefully very, very soon. But today we are joined by the French Institute, the Cultural Institute, and we invited a very special guest from the States, Professor Lindsay Cook. She is an expert on the Notre-Dame Cathedral and the translator of the book Notre-Dame Cathedral, 9 Centuries of History. She translated it from French. The book is by Danny Sandern and Andrew Talon. And the book is dealing with the making of the visuals and how the building literally looked like in different stages of its existence. Lindsay teaches medieval art and architecture. She earned her MA and Ph.D. from the Department of Art History and Archaeology at the Columbia, and her BA in Art History and French from Vassar College. Now she is a PhD assistant teaching professor of Art History School of Art at the Bell State University. Lindsay, I hope I introduced you correctly. You, of course, are invited to add on to so many titles, but we're very excited to have you here. We'll have around 30 to 40 minutes lecture by Lindsay, followed by a discussion first with Jeremie Hoffmann, the head of the conservation department at the Tel Aviv Municipality, but then also open questions by all the speakers and listeners here. So please, Lindsay, you can start your lecture.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And just give me a signal if it's not working, but hopefully it will.
It's great.
Excellent. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here, and I really wish I could be in Tel Aviv in person, quite honestly. I have a sort of secondary interest in modernist architecture, and so I know all about the Liebling Haus, and so I wish I were there today. But today I'm going to talk about the restoration and specifically the ethics of restoration at Notre-Dame of Paris since the 2019 fire. And I'm going to run through quite a few slides, but I'll try to do so quickly enough that we still have plenty of time at the end for questions. And I hope you'll feel free to ask them as we go along. So 1.5 years has elapsed since a catastrophic fire damaged Notre-Dame of Paris, throwing its custodians and admirers for a loop and leaving its structure in a fragile and fragmentary state. The conflagration made the restoration campaign, which was already well underway before the fire, far more complex and exponentially more expensive. Yet it also set off a wave of philanthropic giving, which the restoration project had previously struggled to attract. So since about 2017, there had been a foundation that was raising money for this restoration project, and it had really struggled in many ways to attract a lot of interest from the public around the world. And that really changed after the fire of 2019, as we well know. So this evening, I will begin with a series of hypothetical reconstructions to give you a sense. These all come from the book that Sharon already mentioned. And these hypothetical reconstructions give you a sense of the cathedral as a building that has changed radically over time and dramatically over time, not as a kind of fixed entity, a timeless cathedral, which is, I think, the way that we're inclined to see it on the surface, because we encountered, if we ever went before, we encountered the cathedral as one whole that was still living in our own day. And the reality is that it was transformed many times over the centuries. So the particular reconstructions I've selected, they all come from the book that I translated last year. And the particular images that I'm going to show you really exemplify some of these changes. So I'm not showing you an exhaustive series of them, but just enough that we get the sense of the number of changes that the cathedral underwent from the time it was begun in around 1160 until the present day. So the first one I'm showing you here, around 1177, you can see that the choir is already almost complete, and overall the cathedral was constructed from the east to the west. I think this is a really wonderful image also to show off the distinction between the stone vaults, which are not yet built at this stage, and the wooden roof, which has become such a sort of flashpoint since the fire. So you can see here that we have a cathedral, a choir that has its roof already, the wooden roof, and with a lead covering on the side, but the vaults have not yet been constructed. So the idea is you would, of course, want to enclose the building before you construct the stone vaults, which themselves, if they get wet, if they are exposed to the elements, they would be damaged as well. So here, moving along, by the 13th century, you see that really the outline of the cathedral, even as we know it today, is really intact by this point. And what I really like about these hypothetical reconstructions is they give you a sense also for the chaos of this construction project. And you can imagine that even as all of this was happening, the cathedral was being used liturgically. So this is a really remarkable aspect of the cathedral as it was going up. Even as it's a loud, noisy construction site, it also would have been used for religious services. By 1245, we might think of the building as being done. We see the two great western frontispiece towers. We notice the overall silhouette seems really recognizable to us if we are familiar with this building. But there were still many changes that the building underwent after that. A dramatic one was to rebuild the roof. So here I'm showing you an image from around 1300, a reconstruction of around 1300. And you see some of the really most beloved parts of the building were actually added around this time, from the mid 13th century to the beginning of the 14th. So you're seeing, for example, the rose window here that you see. That wasn't there until the second half of the 13th century. And here by about 1350, you could say that the building in its medieval iteration at the very least was complete by this point. And I think one thing that I want to point out that we may revisit later on is the fact that as much as there are these really stylistically radical transformations that take place over hundreds of years, the basic idea of the building doesn't necessarily change from around 1160. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about restoration today, and particularly the possibility that the cathedral could have been restored with a more, would not have been restored, but rather that the spire and the roof could have been rebuilt in modern materials with a completely new design that's of our own day. And so I can talk about the extent to which that is like or unlike what happened for many hundreds of years in the cathedral's history. So that gives you a sense of how the building sort of came together in a really brief overview. We can see too that after the French Revolution, which led to the destruction of many particularly figural sculpture on the building, especially figural sculpture that included any figure that was wearing a crown, for example, would have been removed. And this was not an act of zealots sort of running and attacking the cathedral. It was much more an administrative decision that was made. And so slowly, bit by bit, for instance, elements like the kings, which had been placed here, representing the biblical kings, these were removed after the French Revolution, and other symbols along those lines. So here I'm showing you a before and after La Suze and Viollet-le-Duc's restoration of the mid-19th century. And so you can see this in this side-by-side that the cathedral, okay, in many ways, especially the western frontispiece, has remained somewhat the same. But we do notice pretty significant changes. There had not been a spire, and I'll get back to this later.
Lindsay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. One second. There are a few listeners that wish that if you can speak a little bit slower, because
of course.
We don't speak English so well. And also from my side, it would be very interesting to just explain who Viollet-le-Duc is for the people who maybe are not from the field of conservation.
Yes, so I'll get to this in more depth later. I'm really just giving you an overview just so that you see the way the building has changed. So it's not necessary that you understand every single word right now. But Viollet-le-Duc, with his restoration partner Jean-Baptiste Lassus, they together collaborated to contribute to dramatically transform the building yet again, to restore it supposedly to a very particular time in its history. And what they ultimately did, though, was to present a new cathedral in the 19th century. And so much of the sculpture that you can see, right, sculpture added here, in the jam figures you see down below, all of these figures, not all of them actually, these here though, for example, and all of these, were inspired by drawings, graphic representations that existed, but in large part they were really recreated in the 19th century by sculptors at the time. This is also the case of some of the most familiar figures on the cathedral, the gargoyles that were added by a sculptor named Geoffroy de Chaume, that's his last name. And there's an excellent book by Michael Camille, the late art historian who was once affiliated with the University of Chicago, who writes specifically about these particular additions in the 19th century. And the subtitle of that book, Medievalism and the Monsters of Modernity, I think really speaks volumes to the fact that these were additions that were very much of the 19th century. These were, it was an imagined Middle Ages that this particular sculptor was engaged with, not a historical version of the Middle Ages. So all of these changes led to the building that we knew. So this image that you saw on the poster is one that I took from the Ile Saint-Louis in 2017. And I would say this is the building that I very much had in mind on the day of the fire in 2019 as well, was this intact cathedral as far as we knew it. And you can see it here. That includes elements like this great spire at the center, which was a part of this 19th century restoration campaign. Now, serving as the basis of all of those hypothetical reconstructions I showed earlier are this laser scan, three-dimensional laser scan, which the architectural historian Andrew Tallon made in 2010. And one of the main goals of creating this laser scan was specifically to create those, to sort of serve as the basis of those hypothetical reconstructions. And so what I find very interesting about this as it results in these models, which look almost like doll houses or something like that, is that there's a very rigorous scientific, there's rigorous scientific data at the base of this, but it's also ultimately imaginative because there are certain elements, once they've been changed over the course of the centuries, of course, they're no longer there. And so scholars then have to make educated guesses about the way the building looked over time. So I would say to proceed with caution if you do end up consulting this book, either in its French version or in its new English translation. What you'll find is something that is, on the one hand, scientific, and on the other hand, comes with a lot of interpretation embedded in it. So by the year 2019, a nonprofit had raised enough money for a major restoration project to get underway at Notre-Dame. And that project was going to begin with the spire. So you're seeing the base of the spire here with some of the sculptures that are attached to it. And as I mentioned earlier, this spire was added to the building in the 19th century. It was designed by the man you see here at right. So I've already mentioned him once, but this is Viollet-le-Duc, an image of Viollet-le-Duc. And actually, it's a statue of the Apostle Thomas, patron saint of architects with the features of Viollet-le-Duc. So this is a bit of a sort of moment of a bit of hubris that we see here, where the architect has had himself represented as one of the apostles on the base of his spire. And at left, so in this series that we have here, we find some similar statues surrounding the base of the spire. And these particular statues, the four that I'm showing you at left, represent 3 apostles and 1 evangelist. So in spring of 2019, the restoration of the spire began, and this was intended to be, I think, a very conspicuous sign that the cathedral was being renovated at this moment, and also was really supposed to attract additional donations to this ongoing restoration project. So I think it was very significant that the spire, which is a very conspicuous part of the building, was the element that they had chosen to begin with. And so this project started first with the construction of scaffolding, steel scaffolding around the base of the spire. And then in early April of 2019, so the very same month of the fire, the temporary removal of the bronze statues that I just showed you earlier of the apostles and evangelists, those began to be removed from the base of the spire. And so this was exactly the scene that you saw in early April 2019, was the removal of these statues. And there was lots of press coverage of this. It was a really notable event in and of itself. These statues were safely transported to a warehouse to undergo a conservation treatment. And so you're seeing them here shortly after they moved into that warehouse. And then, as we know, on April 15th of 2019, the cathedral caught fire, less than a week after the statues had been taken down from the base of the spire. Steel scaffolding, which I mentioned earlier, that had been constructed around the spire to facilitate the restoration, it seems like that's where the fire actually broke out, was underneath that steel scaffolding. The fire melted the spire's lead covering and its timber framework. And so that's what you're seeing here, is the lead itself melting and the wooden core basically showing through as the spire caught fire. And this eventually led the tip of the spire to break off and crash through some of the stone vaults below. And in this photograph, this documents a really key moment for the preservation of the building overall. Until this point, while the fire had spread unimpeded through the wooden roof, the flames had not yet licked the interior of the building. So because, as I showed you at the very beginning, the stone vaults below are separate entities and really freestanding from the wooden roof above, the fact that the wooden roof was destroyed did not necessarily, that did not present a problem to the stone vaults below. But once the spire crashed through one of the vaults, that's exactly when this, the situation really changed and became much more dramatic. So it was the collapse of the spire that really jeopardized the structural stability of the building. Here we're seeing a more distant view of the cathedral in a photograph taken after the spire had fallen and the roof structure overall had collapsed. And what we're left with above the roof line then are the 3 stone gables that once capped the wooden roof. So they used to be the sort of front face, the part that enclosed the wooden roof. And we're seeing them here now just completely freestanding, unsupported by the roof that once was behind these elements. So very scary for anyone who studies the structure of Notre Dame. And after the fire was finally extinguished many hours later, this was more or less the state of the building. And here you see the debris of the wooden roof. So you can see that sort of lying down here, piled up, loading the tops of the thin stone vaults below. You can also notice the snarled steel of the restoration scaffolding, that's what we're seeing up here. And you can see that it's really been turned almost into sculptures or something. I mean, really has been dramatically changed by the fire itself, telling you just how hot also the fire burned. As well as in the void in the midst of the scaffolding. So there's a lot of this sort of steel. especially this big hole, the gaping hole, which has been created by the spire, which fell into this and created this gaping hole below. And to my mind, the clearest sign that something is really amiss in this eerie image is the fact that from this vantage point, which we're standing outside, essentially, from this point outside, we can see through to the interior face of one of the transept rose windows. So we should never be able to see the sort of color of the rose window while we're outside. This is not right. So it's a clear sign that something is really amiss here. With the smoldering cathedral as a backdrop, French President Emmanuel Macron delivered a short speech on the night of the fire. He said, quote, "We will rebuild this cathedral together," as if to reassure listeners that it was possible. In a separate address the next day, he specified that the cathedral would be rebuilt better than ever within 5 years. A cabinet meeting was then called the following day to address the conservation and restoration of Notre-Dame. Afterward, then Prime Minister Édouard Philippe unveiled the cabinet's plan to hold an international architectural competition, which was intended to determine a few things. And this is really important because I don't think this was always represented very well in the press. But the goal of this architectural competition would have been to determine whether the spire should be rebuilt, whether or not the spire should be rebuilt, and if it should be rebuilt, whether it should be a copy of the one designed in the 19th century by Viollet-le-Duc, or if it should instead take the form of what Philippe described as, quote, "a new spire adapted to the techniques and issues of our own day." And I think this is something that we should certainly talk about later, is what exactly would such a spire look like and what was it meant to represent? Appointed to oversee the project was Jean-Louis Georgelin, who now presides over a body known as the Établissement Public, chargé de la conservation et de la restauration de Notre-Dame de Paris. And so Établissement Public is the shortened version of this organization that you'll often hear now described in the press. Now, a law passed in the summer of 2019 stipulated that the 21st century conservation and restoration project must, quote, "preserve the historical, artistic, and architectural interest of the monument in its restored form." And since the night of the fire, Architect-in-Chief Philippe Villeneuve and his team have been doing exactly that. So I think they were already primed for this kind of approach, which is very much the status quo when it comes to historic monuments in France. The cathedral architects were on the scene the very same night of the fire, and their efforts to stabilize the building began immediately. By the time I took this photograph in July 2019, the architects and their crews had already made substantial progress. One of the first measures taken was to install a temporary covering to protect the stone vaults from the elements. And so that's what you're seeing here. It looks almost like an umbrella or something like that. It's relatively provisional in this state. And then another step that followed shortly thereafter was to have wooden braces custom made to cradle the flying buttresses. And so you're seeing just slightly, I think you can see one here, another one over here. And the idea there was that if any of the stone vaults were to collapse, then the buttresses would be neutralized at that point. So this was really a matter of shoring up the building, making sure that if anything else went awry, that that you wouldn't lose additional elements during those shifts and changes. Another key aspect that was really at the top of their list was to take down the scaffolding, which had been installed shortly before the fire broke out. And so this, now damaged after the fire itself, this became a key goal. It needs to be done in order to begin the restoration project in earnest. So you can see it again here, and here there's a better view now of these cradles that have been installed also just to shore up the buttresses. This taken a few months later, relative to the last image I showed, an enormous crane has also now been installed to facilitate just this, the dismantling of the restoration scaffolding. And so particularly this great crane, that's exactly where it's positioned. And this smaller one over here is intended essentially to remove, as the vestiges are cataloged inside the cathedral, this crane is used to help remove basically entire pallets of the remains of the cathedral, which are then brought to the plaza in front of the cathedral, and that's where they're inventoried, is in front of the cathedral. So by February of 2020, a sturdier provisional roof had been constructed, and you're seeing that here. So this is now made of wood instead of that more temporary tarp material. And I took this one on my last research trip to Paris. And not only does this temporary wooden roof protect the vaults below, so it encloses it like a roof, just as the provisional roof also had done, but it also serves another rather ingenious function. And this is one of the most astonishing things that's been happening lately, namely to allow specially trained rope technicians to rappel from the newly built rafters. So they're actually attached in some cases to these rafters above, and they rappel down from the wooden rafters above them into the stone vaults below. And what they're doing in this case is ensuring the stability of the vaults, essentially, and in some cases taking out individual blocks of stone that seem like they're threatening collapse anyway, and to remove them and catalog them, especially because they're still in the exact place where they were originally. It's much more helpful to inventory them at this point than to wait for them to fall to the ground. So a lot of this work has already been done, and the vaults are being monitored continuously to avoid further collapse. So to review, the elements destroyed in the 2019 fire were the lead roof, the elaborate, sophisticated 13th century wooden roof framework, the 19th century spire, composed of a wooden core and lead covering, as well as the stone crossing vault and some cells of the stone vaults of the transept. So really a lot of different kinds of material were damaged or destroyed during the fire. The 2010 laser scan that I showed you earlier, the three-dimensional laser scan, is now part of the composite model, which has been stitched together by a working group of the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, or CNRS. And the CNRS has made a concerted effort in service of the conservation and restoration of the cathedral to put together all of the laser and photogrammetric data in existence that relates to Notre-Dame. So really consolidating all of the information that's available around the world to get the most precise and fullest picture possible of the way the cathedral looked before the fire. And in order to complete the Herculean task of replicating the roof and spire, the architect Villeneuve and his team have not only this composite three-dimensional model, but also their own elaborate hand-drawn technical drawings, which they made prior to the restoration campaign beginning in 2019. But ultimately, however, skilled workers will bring the project to fruition, transforming a paper and a digital cathedral into a material one. Recognizing the enormity of this task, the Établissement Public has even recently circulated an open call for qualified craftspeople, and respondents may be tapped to contribute to this project. So there's a real effort right now, especially as the decision has more recently been made to most likely restore the cathedral identically to the way it was, and especially the spire. Now you need to find skilled craftspeople who will be capable of doing just that. So the cathedral is well documented, and while there are no guarantees, it seems to be more or less structurally stable. And now that there's actually been a year and a half that's elapsed, we're more secure in saying that. It seems like there has been constant monitoring of the site, and it only has moved on, some occasions where it usually is sort of rights itself again, and it's not that the vaults or anything are unstable at this point. So then we might really start to wonder, where do we go from here? And I think a few questions still remain to be answered, some of them with sort of ethical dimensions as well. So first, there's the question of the vaults. And we see here the gaping holes in the limestone vaults, which we saw earlier. So there used to be the Great Crossing Vault was right here, a vault here as well, all made of thin layers of stone. These vaults, as I've already mentioned, have been stabilized to a great extent, but the fire did weaken them. And while we don't necessarily think of limestone as being combustible, it really is, because all, for instance, a lime mortar, right, all that lime really is dissolved limestone. And so it's very possible at the right temperature to, for these stones to just really crumble. So what will be done to them? I think the most helpful parallel is to look to Reims Cathedral, which was shelled during the First World War. And we see here, again, gaping holes in really similar areas of the cathedral. Here, a whole entire cell is gone, that kind of thing. But if we look at Reims today, we can see up above, the stones have been replaced also with limestone. So it seems pretty straightforward that while the same material will not be used, it's not that they will necessarily take the fragments of limestone that survived the fire and put them back into the vault. I think it's very unlikely that will happen, but comparable limestone will most likely be used. So this is a case where you have a substitution, yes, in the 21st century, but at least remaining faithful to the original material. Second, there was the question of the roof, and this is a bit more difficult to answer. And we might wonder, what will it look like? What material should it be built in? And at this point, it seems fairly clear that had the roof not burned down, it would have been left alone. And you see, for instance, here, the 13th century roof made of over 1,000 freshly felled oak trees in the 13th century. It was an integral part of the cathedral and an important example of medieval technology. And so the question now, though, presents itself now that it's really in ruins, is whether it should be built back in the same material, in its original material. And we're seeing here, for example, the restoration architect Philippe Villeneuve in this magnificent space, which no longer exists. There are important precedents for the approach to restore this structure identically, to use wood in the same place where it burned down. But then again, there are also counterexamples. So I think of a place like Chartres Cathedral, which in the 19th century was outfitted with a new roof made of cast and forged iron. But the key there also was that while it's made of an industrial material, it was in the same profile. It followed the exact same profile of the original roof there at Chartres. So you would have no way of knowing, unless you actually climb up all the steps and enter the roof space at Chartres, you would have no way of knowing that it wasn't the original roof. And third, and probably most importantly and interestingly for this group, there is the excellent question of the spire, which has sparked a great deal of controversy since it was first proposed, as I mentioned earlier, that there be an international architectural competition that would determine what to do about the spire. And we already heard that this image presented a view from 2017. And this particular spire, as we see it in this stage, was designed in 1857 by Viollet-le-Duc, and it was constructed by 1859. Yet it's not the first spire Notre-Dame has ever had. So from about the 13th century on, Notre-Dame did have a spire, and you see that here, for example, in a 17th century print, which gives you a sense of the scale and profile of this spire. However, during the French Revolution of 1789, the spire was damaged, and it was later taken down and entirely removed, resulting in the view you see here in this 19th century print, which was inspired by a photograph. Yet the base of the 13th century spire did survive under the roof, and you can actually even see a little, the way that this sort of juts out right here around the center of the building. This is part of the base of that 13th century spire. The two architects who restored the cathedral in the mid-19th century studied the physical remains and graphic traces of the 13th century spire to design their own new spire. And you see here the design they proposed in 1843 as part of their competition drawings for receiving the commission to restore the cathedral in the first place. And while the architects certainly used their imaginations, they really were heavily inspired by the 13th century spire, which, as we know, survived in graphic traces. However, as I already mentioned, in 1857, Viollet-le-Duc, after his partner Lassus's death, he went back to the drawing board and he dramatically revised the spire design. And so you're seeing here a much taller spire, one that has multiple levels of arcades as well. It's much bigger. The architect used as his model the 16th century spire of Amiens Cathedral, which you see here at right. And if your eyes are not deceiving you, if you think you see that Amiens Cathedral spire is not perfectly straight, the Amiens spire really does lean to one side. In fact, as art historian Lynn Courtney has written about beautifully, Viollet-le-Duc was acutely aware of the possibility that this might happen again. And the architect made efforts in the 19th century to ensure that the Notre-Dame spire would hold up in the event of a violent windstorm. He also drew inspiration from the remnants of the base of the 13th century spire, which I mentioned earlier, which he studied extensively before replacing it. He essentially brought that interior apparatus outside for the layered base where the apostles and evangelist symbols were then placed. So all of what you're seeing here was very similar to what used to be made in wood underneath the roof of Notre Dame, revealing that structure. So shortly after the fire, as I mentioned, French President Macron, his cabinet announced that there would be an international architectural design competition to rebuild the cathedral. Numerous architects and historians, however, subsequently vocally opposed that particular initiative, dismissing it as a beleaguered president's vanity project. I personally, I would say I saw it a bit differently. As I think, and as we can talk about more, I think it was really intended as a globalist gesture in the midst of what might otherwise have been a strictly national project. And I still think this tension really does exist about whether this is a symbol only of France or this is a symbol of world cultural heritage. Separate from that official initiative, though, an architecture publication launched an unofficial competition right after the fire, very shortly thereafter. And the winning entry in that competition is shown here at right, and I'm using it to represent the idea of what might have happened with an international competition. This particular design was designed by two Cornell University trained women who were architects at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Unlike the modern roof of Chartres Cathedral, which I mentioned earlier, which is invisible from the exterior and yet made of industrial materials, a project along these lines, like the one you see at right, would have revealed rather than concealed the fact that the restored cathedral will be a product of our own time. For more than a year after the fire, what remained to be seen was whether the spire would be restored identically as it was on the day before the 2019 fire, or whether, in the very spirit of the 19th century design competition, a new spire would be designed for the cathedral of the future. This question is among the most controversial, and it even for a time pitted the restoration architect against the leader of the Établissement Public, the official committee overseeing the project, with the architect, I would say, being very much seeing himself as a custodian of, and seeing himself very much in the tradition of Viollet-le-Duc, that he was there to continue to fulfill that role of taking care of the building. And so the idea of inserting other people into this project, I think, would have been very alarming for him. Whereas the head of the Établissement Public, of course, beholden to the Ministry of Culture and the president himself, had to navigate that political reality of desiring a more internationalist approach to the project. As it turns out, ultimately, the 21st century restoration project will be far less radical than the image you see at right. In July 2020, President Macron signed off on a plan to restore the spire identically, favoring a design more like the image that you see at left, returning the building to that state, than the one you see at right. So in closing, in addition, by the time the 1-year anniversary of the fire rolled around, officials were no longer insisting that the whole restoration project would be finished by 2024. Now, they predict that regular worship services will be able to resume, and the cathedral will be open to the public by 2024. But that does not mean that the entire restoration campaign will be finished by that date. For now, the cathedral remains closed to the public, however, and yet a sign printed on the temporary barrier installed around its perimeter reassures visitors that Notre-Dame's rebirth, or as it's described specifically, Renaissance, is already in progress. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions and enter into our conversational portion of this presentation.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for this very, very professional lecture you gave and the astonishing work you've shown here. I want to raise some questions, and then we can get Jeremie to join us and also the audience. But we call this lecture or this talk today the ethics of reconstruction. And we did that because, as you mentioned, this is a national cultural symbol or an international cultural symbol. So the debate is very big, but also, of course, the history of the building being sort of refurbished by Viollet-le-Duc also raises a lot of questions. As you know, every architecture student that starts to study doctrines of conservation is straightforward introduced to the doctrine of Viollet-le-Duc versus Ruskin, which really allows the sort of modern reinterpretation that would fit sort of the style which is suitable for the architect's taste. So I would firstly want to ask you for your personal opinion. Do you think that this decision to reconstruct the building exactly, that's also, of course, an ethical question, can it be exactly the same? Because it's not the same, of course, materials. Do you think the image as it is, to reconstruct it exactly as it used to be, was that a right decision that was made, or do you think we should have added a layer of time in order to tell the story of the fire?
I think that's exactly it. To me, I taught a seminar about Notre Dame last year, and my students and I worked together on this question, this very question of what would be the best way to approach this. Forget what they actually are going to do, and let's consider what would be, and to think of this for other monuments in the future, what really would be the best. And I think the idea, which I'm not saying this is necessarily what they've already decided to do, but the idea that the building wouldn't show very, very clear signs of the fire and this real trauma that the building has undergone. And I think people who care about Notre Dame also have experienced some degree of this trauma, I think would be really negligent. So I really hope that has a place in the restored building. Initially, as a medievalist, I sort of loved the idea that the cathedral would continue to have a life beyond the one that it had in the 19th century. I don't necessarily think we have to hold on so tightly to the exact forms of Viollet-le-Duc, especially, particularly in this period that we're sort of revisiting monuments from the past and thinking about well, what was happening in France around the time that he was doing that, and what did this symbolize in France at that time, and do we still want to, by repeating that, by copying that, do we really want to reiterate that that is still how we see French society today? I think that's problematic if that's going to be the way that it's interpreted. With that said, I understand, especially with all of these sort of, I hesitate to say fly by night, but sort of, competitions that happened on the side of the actual official project, really some absurd proposals. And I'm not talking actually about the one that I showed, but there were some really truly absurd proposals.
Yeah, I saw an infinity pool on the roof. That was nice.
Exactly. And so I think that the second you saw that, I think there was sort of a backlash against if that was going to be the response, which isn't to say that it would have been. I mean, when you had architects like Jean Nouvel or someone saying, you know, we shouldn't be intervening even at all, then I think that that was part of what caused the backlash, to make sure that it really fit all of the other. But that said, it's also exactly what happens in any other site on any other project since Viollet-le-Duc. I mean, the apparatus that was established in the 19th century to conserve monuments in France was established in that very period. And all of the practitioners today see themselves in a tradition that dates back to that period. So I think it's not so surprising that it's ultimately resulting in this, but I also hope that steps are taken to really mark the event of the fire and to mark changes to French society that have occurred since the 1860s when the restoration was finished.
You've also mentioned crafts, and this is also you know, the question that we have to ask ourselves as conservators or conservationists. Can we or should we, you know, differentiate, at least in the material, from the original, and show sort of what is new and what is old? And another question would be, is there enough good craftsmanship to sort of imitate the know-how that they had when, you know, back when it was built? So.
Yes. So I'll answer the second question first, actually, which is that part of what the Établissement Public has been doing lately, I think, is to demonstrate that there is the know-how in France to do this. And it's possible also that there has not been, as they have asked for craftspeople outside of the ones that they already are aware of to contribute to the project potentially, they haven't been very clear about where those people will come from. And so to my mind, this is another possible way to turn this into an international project, is to really accept proposals also from outside of the country. It's going to be a huge project. I think ultimately, especially in the roof, it will be fairly easy to, it will be clear just based on the age of the oak trees that will ostensibly be used. You're, in a way, you already have that question of, you will never be sort of simulating, you are simulating the materials, and yet it will never be that you're faking the materials, right? Because you can always tell when they were felled. So for that reason, I don't think that's as much of a concern for the roof. The question then becomes, I think, maybe for the spire. And I think that remains to be seen. The other thing, though, is especially for the lead covering of the spire, because lead can be melted down and reused again, it's also entirely possible that they may even decide to reuse some of the lead that they've collected, all of which they've collected in the recovering of the new spire.
Okay, so there are a lot of questions from the audience, but I would like to first invite Dr. Jeremie Hoffmann, who is the head of conservation in Tel Aviv, to also reflect on that, because as you know, and I don't know some of our other audience if they're acquainted with what we do here in Tel Aviv, but of course Tel Aviv is, or Israel at large, is a special case because we have this very large UNESCO World Heritage Site in the center of town, which gets additions. And the question, of course, always remains, how true must we be to, you know, this sort of authentic image of the buildings versus, you know, the additions? Must they be in a contrast, or do they have to fit and suit and just, you know, be an extension of the building? So a lot of ethical debate is happening here in Tel Aviv as well. So I would like to ask Jeremie if it would be up to him to decide how to reconstruct the Notre-Dame Cathedral. What would you think, Jeremie? The big question, I know, but
well, yeah. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi.
First of all, a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I can't imagine the cathedral in the center of Tel Aviv. That would be a little bit odd, strange. We are very modernist here in Tel Aviv. I think your presentation raises a lot of issues, a lot of questions. I have so many notes, and but I think after like thinking about all the issues, I think that my solution would be the idea that that's the end of postmodernism, and that the decision of I didn't know anything of these stories. I mean, I follow up in some level, but I think the decision of Macron, the first idea is kind of avoiding taking a decision, but in fact it's a real decision. It's avoiding being international, and I think it's era of strong nationalism, and I think we have to realize it and understand it, and even if postmodern architects in France are speaking about real conservation, I mean conservative conservation for the building, there is a message here which is very strong, and it's a decision. Although those who know French people, they would speak about innovation while showing the way they preserve the cathedral itself, because they're very much engaged in details, because we look for the, extraordinary ideas about les grands projets de Mitterrand, etc. Like the big contrast, like we love in Tel Aviv, like it's very, very Israeli, to see this big contrast and understanding the new and the old and the relationship between them. And in a way, you could argue they're a little bit more refined in that sense. So it's something to learn. I think we have a lot to learn in that sense. So if there is a lesson here, is first of all understanding the as you said, the relationship between internationalism, like opening society to general ideas, and on the other hand, understanding that we still have to keep the details. And I really admire this, even this decision, which is really not Israeli typical, but it's strong, and there is some power in. And it goes to Viollet-le-Duc. You speak. I think a lot of people don't really know his work, but he was one of the first that spoke about this need of contrast between, in conservation, between the old and new. And there's a big lesson in his work. So I think the big contrast would be keeping the message of Viollet-le-Duc and not changing the message, because then there is a big paradox in what you're doing. So I really admire it.
Sorry, Jeremy, but by keeping the message of Viollet-le-Duc, or by keeping what he added, then you would annihilate sort of his message, no? Because he was...
Yeah, of course.
He
of
wanted
course.
to
paradox.
do...
You can't solve it. It's a paradox. I mean, if you change his work, so yeah, you can't solve this question. But I think the lesson of Viollet-le-Duc, like you showed, this famous face of his sculpture, putting his image inside as a joke, but it's much more than a joke. It's a message. It's trying to say something, maybe about the role of religious and modernism in a way. And there's a lot to learn from his work. I mean, I really admire his text and his ideas, and that's a much stronger lesson about conservation than creating a new form for the roof or whatever. It could be nice, but it's taking a risk, because you never know how people will feel about it, like 10 years after, 20 years after. My family in Paris, they still talk about the new project of Beaubourg, Centre Pompidou, in the center of Tel Aviv, of Paris, of course. and they really know, you know, it's, for them it was just recently opened, and they still don't know how to treat it.
And it's 50 years on, yeah.
Yeah, very well presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. There are a few more questions that I would like to ask you from the audience. The first one is by Karen Meterani. She wants to know, since the cathedral is a World Heritage Site, what kind of assistance or professional discussions came from UNESCO World Heritage Center?
Well, it's interesting. There's a 2-day conference that's going on right now in Paris. And actually, if anyone is interested in following it, you can go and watch it tomorrow. There's a second day. But I would say today, a representative from UNESCO, you know, spoke and supported what has been going on there so far. I would say that it's not been, I can't say that there's been any particular oversight that has changed any of the decisions that have been made so far or anything like that, to the best of my knowledge.
Okay, so another question from the one Eran Mordechovich, who's actually heading UNESCO in Israel. Will the French use this accident to insert new values into the site, some kind of social involvement, new uses of the cathedral, perhaps?
I think that is definitely part of the law that was passed last year. Has to do with basically valorizing the cathedral and showing it off to the public, and making sure, and also especially to do with historic crafts. And so this has already started to happen at things like the European Cultural Heritage Days, which took place last month. There was a demonstration at, you know, full scale of one of the roof framework sections. And so you could see there carpenters working both in modern methods and medieval methods to recreate one of these parts of the roof. And this is an attempt, I mean, it was done in front of the cathedral in this very conspicuous, sort of outlandish way almost. And so that's one of the ways that I think they're trying to already now, even before the cathedral is open to the public, to get people involved. Along the same lines, there's also probably going to be a museum that will be opened, most likely ultimately to present a lot of the vestiges that are not incorporated into the restored building, and to document the fire in that way, which I actually think of that as being, if we're trying to be a little bit more hands-off in the restoration itself, then having something like an interpretive museum really on site would be, or next door, to me is an important step at the very least. You're muted, Sharon.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So another question would be, how is the construction now at the site? Like, what's going on now? I mean, you mentioned a little bit, but perhaps you can go a little bit more into detail.
So they've continued to, what they're working on most right now has to do with taking down the scaffolding. And this is really unfolding now apace. So you can track this. If you see more recent photographs, you'll see that a lot of progress has been made since the photograph I took in February. And that is really, I mean, the person who is responsible, the contractor who is responsible for putting up the scaffolding, it's unusual for the job when you take it down to be this, right? That it's now melted and twisted, and now it's a very perilous job that they're completing at this point. But that's the main thing that's happening. They're also continuing to sort through the vestiges. And so this is what, there are these great tents that are installed in front of the cathedral now, and vestiges are taken basically in sections. So it's really an archaeological excavation essentially that's taking place with the remains. So they take a section, sort through it inside the cathedral itself, and then remove an entire pallet from a particular section and put that pallet then into storage containers, and all of those are filled up on the cathedral plaza. So that's another of the sort of major projects that's still taking place now.
Another question by Mika Tal. You've mentioned the 3D scans did not capture the whole cathedral, and there is room for a scholarly decision regarding some parts. Can you please talk more about the areas that were not captured and how it is going to be approached?
So I don't know, I'm not sure, I don't remember saying exactly that. There were different scans of the cathedral. And so I guess the point I made was that one of the scans, the one that was used for the illustrations in the book, that definitely had gaps in it. So for example, the roof was very incomplete. However, a scan was made in, I can't remember if it was 2014 or 2015, by a separate group. And so there's a perfect laser scan of the roof itself, just the roof. And so the composite model that I showed later on in the talk, that is really dense and almost perfectly complete with a couple of exceptions. Those gaps are things like the tower. One of the towers, there's a sort of missing section because the westwork held up. It's just not that important a part of the scan anyway. But it really has to do with where you set up the laser scanner and how many points you decide to take. That has to do with the density and how the completeness of the laser scan.
So if I understand correct, the laser scans, they were done actually before. Is it part of the book you were mentioning before?
Yes. So it's there are renderings from the laser scan which are sort of more raw that are presented as illustrations in the book, but also all of those hypothetical reconstructions are essentially artist renderings that are on top of the laser scan. So there is texture and that kind of thing that the artist has added, but the measurements underneath are based on the laser scan. And that includes a plan that is much more accurate than any of the plans that had been published of the cathedral previously. So things like the nave, which is very wonky, to put it mildly. The structure of the nave piers, for example, one pier is not flush with the one all the way across it in the nave. So those kinds of things are really apparent in this new plan, which is thanks to the laser scan.
But this is this the base of the reconstruction drawings?
I have to say, there were already so many, the architect is, again, in the tradition of Viollet-le-Duc a little bit, is very, hands-on and has his technical skills and has been trained a specific way. And so many of these technical drawings were already made separate from the laser scan. And I honestly think it's more likely that those architectural drawings will be the ones that inform the restoration more than anything. Mm-hmm. So it's more for research. The laser scan is much more for scholars now to investigate the cathedral further.
Yeah. So also going back to, you mentioned Emmanuel Macron has really devoted himself to the project. And you also mentioned that he's changed some sort of administrative model regarding who's in charge administratively of the site itself. What do you think of, maybe politically now, of the involvement of Macron in this and raising so much money and really changing this whole administrative approach to it? What are your thoughts on that?
I have to say I was very alarmed when it seemed like he was trying to circumvent the existing system, because there are already, people go to school from the very beginning expecting that this is going to be the particular function of their job once they get it ultimately. And I think that this really disrupted that system. So I would say within the country, it wasn't surprising that there was a backlash initially to the idea that someone else was going to be in charge, even besides the architect himself. So having additional, more and more bosses sort of added to the top of the chain was a novel case here. And I think it could potentially have pitfalls in the future. But that said, there's no building, at least there's no medieval building that I think would attract this kind of attention. Another one in France. And so I think that, especially now that it's turned out this way, that it seems like Philippe Villeneuve will have his say. I think it's unlikely that this will really ultimately happen in the end, that there's a challenge to that existing long-standing system.
So there's one more remark by Aran Mordechowicz. I think UNESCO already expressed their opinion that restoration should be one-to-one. Mm-hmm. Ecomos France was also in favor of conservative restoration. And I'm sure not all French ICOMOS members were supporting this. So, yeah, okay. So, yeah, that's very interesting. All this debate about who was supporting what. But I actually read somewhere that you also tour Jerusalem, like you made tours.
I did.
So I'm just curious now, maybe a little bit of your past experience in Jerusalem, and what do you tour and where, and that's very interesting as well for us here in Israel.
Yes, I was involved with it's true. It's now been several years ago now, but it was in 2014 that I was involved with an excursion, an undergraduate seminar excursion. Columbia University puts together these incredible seminars for their undergraduates where they are all funded to go on a trip led by a faculty member and a graduate student. So this was while I was still a graduate fellow at Columbia. And so I'm a medievalist, as we know, of the Christian West, and I worked with the Islamicist at Columbia, who's Israeli himself, and we traveled to Jerusalem and the West Bank and had a very action-packed spring break is what it was in 2014, and I will never forget it. I still use all of my research materials I developed at that time in teaching, and it was a really incredible experience.
Wow, so maybe next time we can tour with you and have our experts come on board as well. That would be very interesting for us. There are so many scholars here and professors, and I'm very pleased that so many participants have joined. I'm asking now again if anybody wants to add something to this discussion. It's also okay to do it live via Zoom and not to write it. And if it's not the case, I would like to really thank you again for this wonderful, extraordinary, everybody writes it here, the way you explained it in the depth of your research. And there's also one more remark, a very long one, which I don't know if I can read, but yeah, I think it's too long for me. So if Samuel wants to go online and talk, he's welcome. And if not, then I would like to thank you again, Lindsay, for this wonderful encounter with what's going on now in Paris and Notre-Dame, and we hope to have you here maybe one day to do research together. There's lots of stuff to still be done here, and hope to see you again. For everybody else who's still here, next week we're talking about what we call in German Umbaukultur, which is the architecture of altering. Tim Reinitz, a professor and an architect, states that most of the buildings are already there, and we should reuse the existing fabric of building, because there is lots of energy and potential in the buildings. If they're conservation or not, it doesn't matter. But also the resources are not only physical, but also, of course, ethical, and all the memories that are embedded in the fabric should really, really be used. And this is why we have to rethink of our approach concerning renovations of cities at large. So this is what he's going to state, how to really alter what is already there for future generations. So that's also a very interesting new and modern approach to refurbishment that he's going to state. So everybody who's here, I'm very pleased to welcome you to next week, Monday at 8 again. And Lindsay, thank you again for this wonderful lecture. It's going to be online in our archive, and I really hope to see you again soon.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.